Well, I'd like to welcome our listeners out there to another edition of the DC Capstone Report. It's great to be coming with you again this week. In this week's show, we're going to have on the podcast, we'll have three segments as normal. In the first segment, we're going to discuss Coach Saban's comments after the first week of practice, see where the team is looking and where it's headed. In our second segment, we're going to go look at the defense and see who might have been stepping up as leaders on defense. And then finally, in our third segment, we're going to look at the offense and see who might be the leaders on offense this year after our first practice.
You've been listening to the DC Capstone Report. The DC Capstone Report is featured each Tuesday morning on Tide 102.9, The Morning Blitz with Martin Houston. You can listen live at Tide1029.com.
Well, it's good to be back for another DC Capstone Report. Here in our first segment today. Before we get started, I just want to talk to our listeners out there for just a second. You know, a couple of weeks ago, Gary Shores, who is the brains behind the idea of the DC Capstone Report, passed away unexpectedly, and we are continuing this on in his honor and his memory. And I'm working with his brother, Lance Shores. So Lance will be the one that's working with me on this, the DC Capstone Report to come. Gary was a great individual, and we want to do him justice, and we want to do him in his memory, do a great job going forward, and we're going to try to make the content very interesting and allow you, our listeners out there, some opportunities to take advantage of some other things. So if you haven't heard the tribute that we did for Gary, it's posted on the DC Capstone Report Facebook page. You can also find it at freelancepictures.com. That's freelancepictures.com. If any of you out there knew Gary, I would suggest you go and listen to that tribute if you haven't. It is a great in memorial to him. So we look forward to carrying on the DC Capstone Report in his memory and in his honor. So today, Lance, what we're going to do in this first segment, it's been the first week of practice, and I know our listeners out there are excited about having some opportunities to talk about football and playing the game, leading up to this Louisville game that's going to kick off here at the very 1st of September. And the practice has got started, and I think it's been interesting this year. It's a young team, and hearing Coach Saban talk, one of the things I've noticed about is his in everything he's talked about so far, he seems to stress the word toughness, and I think he's doing that for a purpose because this team is going to be a young team, especially on defense, somewhat young on offense and some of the skill positions, and I think he is counting on needing some of these young players to step up this year. And in so doing, I think he's had an opportunity to talk about toughness and what toughness means. And the kind of the saying that he's used throughout this early week of fall practice has been, what will break you? And so what he's trying to do is he's pushing these players to the limit to determine what will break them, and that'll determine if they can push through that point, determine the toughness they have. And I think the toughness is what they're going to need. It's been interesting to watch Coach Saban on those behind-the-scenes shows that ESPN is showing. It's called Rolling with the Tide. For our listeners out there who hadn't had a chance to see it, it's worth your time for that hour to kind of look behind the scenes at the Alabama football team. But Coach Saban has really harped on this idea of toughness and trying to beat that into the players. And I think we're going to need it. What he's talked about after the first practice, the first week of practice, and after that first scrimmage was that the team members that have been there a while, that's been through what the process. They did well in that first scrimmage and have done well in practice. But the younger ones coming along need a little more get to know the process and how to work within the process. They're having trouble playing through the heat, playing through injuries, and getting to that breaking point. So I think there's been some leaders that emerge that are going to help out on defense and help out on offense, and we'll see that team gel together. Another thing that came out of Coach Saban's talk at the end of the scrimmage this week was there was a couple of injuries that took place. One to Jamie Mosley, defensive linebacker, which we kind of need him because we're thin at linebacker on the defensive outside linebacker position which he plays. He's a fifth-year senior, and he'll do us a great job there. He got nicked up a little bit in the scrimmage. but it looks like he should be back for the first game, according to Coach Saban. Not so much good news on Daniel Wright. Our defensive backs have been really thin this year because of everyone that's graduated and moved on to the NFL. But Daniel Wright was expected to play a big role this year, but seems to have gotten some type of shoulder injury in the very first scrimmage. I think he's going to consult the parents, and I think when you do that, you're looking at what kind of long-term health, and so it might be a little more serious, and I'm not sure that he'll be available for the year, but we look for him to get a recovery. But coming out of that first week of practice, I think Coach Saban talking about toughness and kind of updating us on where he's going to be. Look for this team to in the weeks ahead for him to mold these young men, put them to their breaking point, to let them realize what will break them so they can become tough and get used to the process.
You've been listening to the DC Capstone Report. The DC Capstone Report is brought to you each time this week by freelancepictures.com.
Well, in the second segment today, Lance, I want to discuss the defense. It seemed like in that first scrimmage, the defense seemed to be ahead of the offense, and that's not uncommon. A lot of times we see that the defense is ahead of the offense in certain early in the year when you begin the first practices. But this year, the Alabama's defense is going to be really thin for experience. And the first teamers, are all great across the board. But, for years, Alabama has been able to dig deep. And our second team that come in, there's no fall off in our third team. And so there's been opportunities for players to step up and play and enjoy. We've enjoyed that along the way. This year, I don't think we'll enjoy the second team, third team being able to come in and be as good as the first team unless they really improve. Listening to what Coach Saban said, the ones did such a great job in practice this time and in the scrimmage this time, but the younger kids behind them have a long way to go to catch up. And there's still time to do that before the first game, but I just look for our defense to gel. I believe it'll be a strong point for us as long as we stay injury-free. And I know, as you heard in our first segment, we did have a few injury bugs this week by us in the scrimmage. If we can steer clear of the injuries, I still think we'll have a good defensive team coming out. Two players that I want to highlight here on the defensive side of the ball is Xavier McKinney. It seems to be that Xavier McKinney has really stepped up in that defensive backfield, and it looks like that he can play almost any position back there and do a good job at it. And so I've heard some good things of him coming out of it. So I think that's really a big thing to have someone identify early in the first week of practice that's going to help shore up that defensive backfield. So look for Xavier McKinney to really come up and do a good job as we're going forward. Listen for his name as he leads into that first game of the year. The other player on defense that I really think that we're going to really enjoy watching the play this year is Mack Wilson. Everything I've heard, and I have a kind of a behind-the-scenes unnamed source that gives me information from time to time, and that person is telling me that Mack Wilson has taken the role of leader on and really just owning that leadership role and doing a good job. And it looks like he's bringing some of the young guys along as well, and his tenacity is able to run the field, his work ethic, all that's playing out in the field. We know he's a hard hitter and does a great job. But I think look for Mack Wilson on defense to be another great Alabama defensive linebacker that has a great future in the NFL. If he stays healthy and Dylan Moses stays healthy, I really believe we're going to have a solid linebacking core up front. Now behind them, we're looking for people to step up and make some plays. And I think there's opportunities for some freshmen, late arriving freshmen and other freshmen to step up and make a difference in the linebacking core as long as they get some reps in practice. But look for Dylan Moses and look for Mack Wilson to carry that linebacking core and really be a catalyst for the defense going into that first game.
You've been listening to the DC Capstone Report. The DC Capstone Report is featured each Tuesday morning on Tide 102.9, The Morning Blitz with Martin Houston. You can listen live at Tide1029.com.
Well, Lance, on the third segment, I want to concentrate on the offense. I know it's been a big question mark going in, who's going to be our quarterback and who's going to lead us, but I think there's some other great things on offense that we don't talk about as much I think we need to talk about. And this podcast, as we talked earlier in the show about Gary and his passing, Gary would have loved this part of the podcast because we're going to talk about the offensive line, and he was one of the great offensive linemen in high school, did a great job, and he has a affinity for offensive line. Well, Lance, the offensive line doesn't get much talk about. They don't. Our listeners out there know we see them. They know what they do for us, but they don't get talked about. They hardly get noticed. On the behind-the-scenes show, I saw Ross Piercebaker and Jonah Williams talking about walking around Tuscaloosa and not getting noticed by name because they're offensive linemen. But this offensive line across the board with Piercebaker, Jonah Williams, Alex Leatherwood, and Lester Cotton, and those guys doing a great job. And then right behind them, you got Matt Womack and Jedrick Wills and Deontay Brown. Those are great offensive linemen. I think that we're going to have an opportunity to have one of our strongest offensive lines that we've had in quite some time. I look for us to compete well with our offensive line, especially in the run game, because right behind that offensive line, we have one of the best running back corps ever. And when you're talking about Damian Harris and Najee Harris, and then coming back with Josh Jacobs and Brian Robinson, those four running backs are going to just really have an opportunity to carry our running game to a new level behind this offensive line. So I think that's going to be a really good point in our offense. We're going to be really stable on the offensive line this year. They're going to gel and come together. Even this first scrimmage and in the first practice, it seems like they're working together better than what I'm hearing. And so I think this offensive line is going to gel and come together and do a really good job for our running game. And I believe that running game is going to take the pressure off of our quarterbacks and our receivers. Now, one thing I want to highlight is our young receivers. Our young receivers were freshmen last year. You got Henry Ruggs III and Devontae Smith and Jerry Jeudy coming back and playing this year. What I heard in the first scrimmage, Jerry Jeudy did some great things. But we also got Tyrell Shavers, who was redshirted last year, coming in and playing. He is a long body. He has that height on him that can really go up and contend for those balls that you want to put up a 50-50 ball. He can go up and catch those. But the name that I'm hearing coming out of spring, this fall practice this year, that looks like you're just not going to be able to keep that 5-star freshman out of Texas, Waddell, off the field. It seems like he is just really coming in and showing out not only his speed but his route running and his maturity in play. So look for Waddell to come in and really get some playing time and push some of our other receivers that have earned these spots for some playing times. And I think he can burn you deep. He can run routes. And he's a good catch the ball well. So between those wide receivers and some others that are coming on, I think our wide receiving core is going to eventually be a positive as well. Well, the last thing we're going to talk about in our segment today on the offense has to be the quarterback. We can't ignore that quarterback competition, that quarterback controversy between Tua Tagovailoa and Jalen Hurts. Now, I've always been a big Jalen Hurts supporter. I think he's done a great job. Only lost 2 games in his career, and so I've always been a big Jalen Hurts supporter. I also like Tua. I think Tua is a great upside to him. I think either one of the quarterbacks would do well. I think this past week at the media fan day, when the media got before Jalen Hurts, he made some comments that were way out there, and they were featured in all the media outlets, and he seemed to be kind of throwing his coaches or Coach Saban under the bus a little bit. Coach Saban spoke to that this week. He said, "Hey, my players have opportunity to say what they want to say. It's not going to affect his ability to play or start in the game if he wins the competition." But behind the scenes, I'm told that really was a distraction. That there was a team-only meeting and finally had to hash out all that. And I think hopefully they put that behind them and they can go forward with this quarterback competition through the fall. After the first scrimmage, of what I'm hearing, even though there was no statistics released from some of the folks who were there that I've heard from, Tua did a great job throwing for several touchdowns and no interceptions, and Jalen just had a bad performance where he threw several interceptions in the game, in the scrimmage. So it looks like Tua is ahead right now, maybe in this quarterback competition. But Coach Saban said it's too early to tell, and as many of our listeners know out there, he can carry these quarterback competitions even into the first or second game as he's done in the past. So look for this Tua versus Jalen quarterback competition to continue in the fall practices and into the scrimmages, and maybe as we get closer to the game, we'll have an idea of who might trot out there first and take that first snap for the Alabama offense. But my opinion on that is either quarterback can lead us to victory in the games, and either one of them can lead us to a championship this year. We have the surrounding line, the receiving core, and the running backs to make any of our quarterbacks look good. So either one that goes out there, I think Alabama is poised again for another national championship run.
You've been listening to the DC Capstone Report. The DC Capstone Report is brought to you by freelancepictures.com. Be sure to go online and check us out for other valuable Alabama football content. And go on Facebook and like the DC Capstone Report page for future updates.